Martha Minow still, and as Dean at Harvard Law School, it gives me tremendous pleasure and a little trepidation to introduce Richard Susskind, who has for some time now been explaining to lawyers around the world that we have to understand the world is changing dramatically, and its significance for law and justice I think is now becoming clear, but Richard is someone who understood this long before anyone else. I'm going to just quote for you some of the words that have been used in describing his work. Provocative, forward-looking, eye-opening, trenchant, and he and his son Daniel have written a book not long ago that brings to bear the developments in the digital world on all of the professions. Richard Susskind is a visionary in law and an expert in computers. He brings an understanding of how online tools can transform law, but here's what's very fascinating to me, how it can improve it. That's the title today, upgrading. There's so many things I can say about him. You should know about his role in the UK Civil Justice Council Advisory Project, developing online dispute resolution, his professorships at Oxford, to other universities. I could go on, but then I'd be taking money from him. And time. He has remarkable offspring. I've already referred to one. We're also indebted to son Jamie, who is a scholar and technological change and political theory, and collaborating here with the Berkman Klein Center. We're grateful to Jamie for helping to give your dad as incentive for coming here. And Richard, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. You may not recognize this man. His name's J.B.S. Haldane, an evolutionary biologist. And I came across his work some years ago, and he'd written an article, I think it was entitled The Truth About Death, and it was published in the Journal of Genetics in the 60s. And what he said of scientific theories, I think, applies quite well to the work I and others have been doing in thinking about the future of legal services. So as the Dean said, I have been going on about this for some time, my fundamental premise that technology is relevant for and will bring about fundamental change and improvement to the legal system. But the message was not always well received. And what Haldane said is in science you find that theories go through 4 stages of acceptance. And I looked at this and I thought actually that maps rather well onto my own work. And so the first stage of acceptance is where people say when they hear something new, and this corresponded to when I finished my doctorate in Oxford, which was in AI and law. I finished in 86, and people by and large were saying this is worthless nonsense. I was talking about how lawyers might be replaced by machines in due course. Ten years later, the second stage of J.B.S. Haldane, I wrote a book called The Future of Law. And the general feeling was this is an interesting, but it's a perverse point of view. The third phase, 2006, just before I published my book, The End of Lawyers, people were saying this is true, but it's quite unimportant. And now I think last year, pretty widely thought that we're in the fourth stage. I've always said so. And I think it is true across the world, both deans of law schools, senior partners in law firms, general counsel and major corporations are now recognizing that the legal world is set for a period of considerable transformation. And I want to give you a flavor of that transformation today by looking at 7 different subjects. The future, not so much what the future holds, but how to think about the future. Secondly, the pressures, I argue, that we're seeing on law firms in particular in this turbulent legal world. Thirdly, focus in on what may be of interest to some of you, how this affects the very largest of law firms under the heading of big law. But I then want to step back and talk about something which is more important to me, which is about access to justice, not for major businesses, but for individuals. And I think we have a major problem around the world of inaccess to justice. That'll lead me to talk about some work that was mentioned again by the Dean in the opening remarks that I've been doing in the field of online courts. But ultimately, I want to return to technology and speak about artificial intelligence, which has been receiving a great deal of attention in the legal world over the last few months. And finally, say, well, what does this mean for legal education? In a sense, this talk is quite superficial. I'm skirting across all these topics, but in my books and writings, all of these are dealt with at some greater depth, but I wanted to give you a flavor of my line of thinking. So let's think about the future and my favorite story in life about Black & Decker, one of the world's leading manufacturers of power tools. And apparently when they recruit new executives, they take them off on a course, they sit them down in a room, and they put up a slide much like the slide before you. And they say to the assembled new executives, this is what we sell, isn't it? And the new executives look rather surprised by this. They say, of course that's what we sell. We're Black & Decker. We're the world's leading manufacturers of power tools. The trainers, with some satisfaction, say, that's not actually what we sell, because that's not really what our customers want. This is what our customers want. And it's your job as new executives to find ever more creative, imaginative, competitive ways of giving our customers what they want. And there's a wonderful lesson here, I think, for everyone involved in the legal world, whether you're a practitioner, a judge, a student, or a professor. We tend in the legal world, when thinking about the future, to be of power drill mentality. We tend to think, what do we do today and how can we make it perhaps a little bit cheaper, quicker, better? Not often enough do we take the step back and ask the fundamental question, what's the hole in the wall in the world that we occupy? Why is it, for example, if you're a law firm, that our clients pay handsomely for our services? Now, I've been asking this question for 25 years. It's just to give people a perspective on thinking about the future, because the future, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to technology applied to the law, is not simply a systematized, mechanized, optimized, streamlined version of what we have today. The technologies we're seeing emerging are going to change the way that major clients solve their legal problems, that citizens gain access to justice, indeed the way that we teach law and lawyers. And one has to think, I think, in a more broad-minded way, in a more open way, because of several pressures we're seeing undoubtedly on law firms. I call these the more for less challenge, new competition and technology. More for less challenge summarized by general counsel, the main lawyers in major organizations, who often say to me three things. They say, firstly, we're under pressure to reduce our internal headcount, the number of lawyers we have. Secondly, we're under pressure to spend less on external law firms. And yet, thirdly, we have got more legal and compliance work to do than ever before. This is the reality for many major clients. More legal work, less resource. And I call this the more for less challenge. And it will define, it will underpin the next decade of legal practice. Now, my practical solution to this, which I put forward in 2008, a little earlier, but I think is largely accepted now, is that the challenge of taking the cost out of legal service is to look at legal work that is routine, repetitive, administrative, process-based, and find different ways of undertaking that work. But this requires you, and it's a rather unfortunate word, but it requires you to decompose, to break down, to disaggregate, to unbundle complex deals and disputes, and find out the tasks that are involved, and then ask of each task, what's the most important, or rather most efficient way of doing that work? So let me take, for example, dispute resolution. Historically, when I was in practice, what happened was a client had a dispute and they thought, do we do it ourselves? Do we hand it to a law firm? And now we see there's a different way of looking at it. You can see that there's actually, and I'm not saying this is definitive, it's just an example of how I do it. You can divide dispute resolution into the 9 tasks you see before you. And then ask of each task, who's the best place to undertake that work? Now, I did some research in about 2004, 2005, asking the finest law firms around the world, which of these 9 tasks in dispute resolution are you, as a law firm, uniquely qualified to undertake? And the most amazing response came, and it was in England, 2, strategy and tactics. In the US, the great firms added a 3rd, which was advocacy. Because there was recognition then, even then, that a lot of the other work that goes on in litigation, reviewing documents, undertaking research, the project management, for example, could be undertaken by a new wave of suppliers at a lower cost and to a higher quality. And that's why I wrote a book, The End of Lawyers? Because it occurred to me, if we apply a kind of manufacturing production mentality to the delivery of legal services, if we decompose work and we see that much of the work can actually be unpacked and delivered differently by non-legal providers, then that's surely of profound impact or implication for the legal world. And for those who are involved with transactions, it's exactly the same. You can divide a deal into these 9 different tasks. I say again, not definitive, but gives you a flavor of my line of thinking. And the final step in this argument is that there are at least now 16 different ways of sourcing legal services. No longer is it insourcing by the client or handing it out to the law firm. There's all these new options, outsourcing, offshoring, subcontracting, and the rest of it. The details don't matter. It's a line of thinking here. That no longer is legal work some monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff that can only be done by one organization. We're seeing a far more flexible way of delivering legal service. And so that's the first pressure on law firms. The more for less pressure. The second is new competition. Now, some people want to talk in this context of the Legal Services Act 2007 in England, the Liberalisation Act, which allows non-lawyers to deliver legal services. It allows private equity and venture capital to put into legal businesses. It allows the establishment of a new kind of legal business called the alternative business structure. Now that's important, and it's changing particularly consumer law in our country. But the bigger point I'm making here to major law firms is this, that the competition that kills you doesn't look like you. When you're in a time of great change, at an inflection point, as I believe we are, what we're seeing is new competitors in the marketplace who are delivering legal services in different ways. And so the real competition for the law firms is not the ones that they look at all the time, it's the accountancy firms. And David Wilkins, who's here today, has written an article precisely on this, the Big Four returning to the legal world. PwC already has 3,500 lawyers in 90 countries. They're just warming up. Deloitte spent more last year on training than the fee income of the largest law firm in the world, just to give you an idea of scale. And then there's the publishers, people like Thomson Reuters. If they were a law firm in terms of the number of qualified lawyers they have, they'd be the 10th largest firm in the world. They've also got 2,000 software engineers. They own the leading package that delivers document automation. They own a system service really, that delivers know-how and research. They have a legal process outsourcing company in India. They're very credible competitors to conventional law firms. In England, there's the alternative business structures. And then there's the legal tech startups. Just a few years ago, there was a couple of dozen of these. Now there are over 1,000. Each one trying to do to a corner of law what Amazon did to book selling. And also a competitor, of course, in-house legal departments, where the legal work is no longer done by law firms, it's done in-house. And you'll see we're going through, and I think it's slightly cyclical, but we're going through a period where in-house legal departments, by and large, are getting larger. And so if you imagine the average law firm as the character in the middle there, swimming along in confidence that they have the competition, the inferior competition, well within its sights, I'm suggesting they perhaps have no sense at all of what's coming up from behind. So think about this, the 2 stages. Huge commercial pressure, that's to say the more for less challenge on the one hand, and on the other hand, new players in the marketplace. This is building to be a perfect storm. But technology, for me, the third element, will have the most profound implications. I take you back to 1996 when I wrote a book called The Future of Law. And in that book, and this sounds completely absurd now, one of my themes was about electronic communications. And I was giving lots of talks at the time saying the dominant way that lawyers and clients will come to communicate in the future, I was claiming, was email. Now this, of course, sounds, as I say, faintly absurd now. But at the time when I was making this suggestion, the Law Society of England and Wales said I shouldn't be allowed to speak in public. And that I was bringing the legal profession into disrepute by suggesting email would be the dominant way of communication between lawyers and clients. I say this today not to, maybe just a little bit to vindicate, but more to say to you that I will be pointing to a number of technologies over the next 10 or 15 minutes, and as law students, you may think, well, I can see what he's saying, but how does it really apply to law? I think they're all way more predictable than email was in 96. Now, the way that Daniel, my son and co-author, he's an economist at Oxford, the way we look at technology and the way we explain it is under 4 headings. We talk about the exponential growth in the underpinning technologies. We talk about our machines, and this is in a sense our signature phrase, becoming increasingly capable. The systems around the world are taking on more and more tasks. No one in Silicon Valley is dusting their hands off and saying, job done, we'll call it a day now. Our systems are doing more and more. They're also becoming increasingly pervasive, not just because we all carry handhelds, but also through the Internet of Things that chips are embodied in and being embedded in millions and soon billions of everyday objects. And finally, as human beings, we're becoming increasingly connected. I want to talk a little bit more about the first, second, and fourth of these, just to give you a flavour of the exciting times in which you have been born. Now, to understand the exponential growth in technology, you need to think not of a law of the land, but of Moore's law. Gordon Moore, the man who 52 years ago said something apparently innocuous. He said that, and this is a huge paraphrase, but said every couple of years the processing power of computers would double. Now, those of you who enjoy math will remember that if you actually keep on doubling anything, although at the beginning there seems to be some kind of shallow and not particularly great effect, in due course this gives rise to an explosive growth in whatever phenomenon we're concerned with. And almost under any heading when you look at technology, we're seeing exponential growth. Let me give you a flavor of exponential growth in action. Take an A4 sheet of paper, 0.06 millimeters in thickness. Fold it over once in itself, again in itself, 4 times in itself. It then becomes the thickness of a credit card. Nothing remarkable there. After 11 further folds, it becomes the height of a Coke can. Not yet amazing. After 21 folds, it's the height of Big Ben. After 43 folds, it's the distance from here to the moon. And after 100 folds, it's 8 billion light years in thickness. This is what happens when you keep doubling anything. And it sounds science fictional. And I want to make the point to you as strongly as I can that what's happening in processing power signals that we are living in a time of greater and more rapid technological progress than the world has ever seen.